Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to those in the U.S. My name is William Stork. I'm an MBA student at Stanford and a co-president and head of content at Brazil at Silicon Valley. It's an honor to welcome you to our second event of the year. Today, we'll host a fireside chat that truly embodies our mission. We'll bring together two of the brightest minds from the Silicon Valley, discussing the impact of technology and innovation to industries, governments, and society. But before we begin, I want to recognize the support of our sponsors, who make the Brazil at Silicon Valley movement possible. Autodiagnósticos, Bank of America, BTG Pactual, Global Ventures, Google for Startups, IBM, Instituto D'Or, Magalu, Pinheiro Neto Advogados, SoftBank, Stone, and Valor Capital. To all our sponsors, thank you. I also want to thank you, our Brazil at Silicon Valley team, a group of exceptional students that put a lot of effort to make this event possible. To kick off today's discussion, I'm honored to introduce your guests. First, we welcome Joe Lonsdale. Joe's the managing partner at AgTech, a US-based venture capital firm that manages several $1 billion. He was an early investor in Wish, Oculus, acquired by Facebook, Guardant Health, OSCR, Anduril, and Relay IQ, acquired by Salesforce. He also co-founded Affinity, Asper, SwiftScale Bio, and Resilience Bio with his team out of the APC Build program. Joe has been on the Forbes 100 Midas List since 2016. He also began his career at Clarion Capital, which he helped grow into a global hedge fund and worked with PayPal while he attended Stanford University. Joe also co-founded Palantir, a global software company focused on defense and other industries. He also founded and remains chairman of Adapar, a wealth management technology platform with assets over $2.5 trillion, and OpenGov, providing software for over 2,000 municipalities and state agencies. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And now I welcome our moderator, Rob Siegel. He's currently a lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, teaching two of the school's most iconic courses, Entrepreneurial Finance and The Industrialist Dilemma. He's also a general partner at Exceed Capital, an early-stage investment firm, and a venture partner at Piva, a board member for several technology companies in the Valley. Previously, Rob was also a co-founder and CEO at Weave Innovations and a successful tech executive, holding leadership positions at General Electric and Intel. Rob holds a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and an MBA from the Stanford GSB. Rob, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Rob. And at the end, we'll also have a Q&A session. So feel free to send questions through the platform or YouTube. And now I'll send it over to you, Rob, to kick off the discussion.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here and great to see everybody. And Joe, it's always wonderful to reconnect.
Thanks, Rob.
So Joe, I want to get started by talking a little bit about how your career has evolved. You were an entrepreneur to start, you've become a successful venture capitalist. Can you talk a little bit about the progression in your career and how the activities of the early stages of what you did have shaped your activities in the most recent years?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of what we're doing is pretty similar. When you're building a company, you learn there's a lot of lessons from entrepreneurship, and you have to recruit these teams of amazing people. And a lot of times, the best companies, I think you're recruiting people who maybe would have started their own company, but you convince them to come help you build instead. And you're managing a lot of these people, and it's pretty common, of course, for some of them to then leave and build their own things. And so, as Palantir had gone to be a much larger company. And even as I was working on Adapar, and similarly, you have people I'd worked with before who I admired, who did a good job, transitioned out properly, and were working on their new companies. And so, I found myself a decade ago still mentoring maybe 15 of these people who are running their own firms. And I was an angel investor, like everyone very commonly becomes, around this ecosystem, and kind of helping them in different ways. And when I saw how I was spending my time and talked to my mentors, they said, Joe, you're basically already running a fund that you just don't have very much money around you, or don't really have enough people helping you. So you do a lot better job if you actually had a fund for real instead of just doing it as your hobby. And so I think these things are very similar. For me, the compulsion is, how do you solve problems? How do you fix things that are broken in the world? How do you take things and make them work better? And you can start companies, which I continue to do. I still build companies all the time. I love doing that. but you can also help someone else start a company. You can help them create advantages for them. You can mentor them. You could do various things to work with them. And so I think the process of either building companies or helping others build companies is for me, it's all very similar. And I think it's no surprise you see that the highest returning venture capitalists in the recent generation, pretty much all of them are created companies before they became venture capitalists.
Let's talk about that. You had a lot of success as an entrepreneur. What did you learn as an entrepreneur that you look for when, as an investor, when you seek out the next generation of entrepreneurial leaders?
Well, you learn these things are a lot harder than they look from the outside, and they're a lot messier. And persistence is really important. Just like work ethic, extreme work ethic. The way I describe trying to build a multi-billion-dollar technology company, it's like training for a gold medal in the Olympics. You can't do it part-time. You're not going to get the gold medal because you have really good work-life balance. And so work-life balance is important, but you probably shouldn't be a founder if you're going to want that balance during those years when you're creating it. Is my bias. And so you have to look for people who are obsessed, who are really interested. You can't pretend that you like an area. You have to actually like it. I think there's always studies on how our brains work. When you actually feel emotional about something and really care about it, your brain just works better. So you need people who are truly passionate, who are able to attract other great people. And it needs to be like a mission. It's like these things only work if they're a cause where people accuse Palantir of being a little cultish early on, but it kind of has to be this cause where you're really obsessed with it, because that's the only way to overcome all the barriers. The world's kind of set up to be against you and to make these things fail and to stop them from working. And so only if you're just really convinced and really bringing on the right people and resources, et cetera, are you going to make it over the top to make them work.
Would it be fair to say that in some respect, all successful entrepreneurial companies have kind of that mission mindset, that mission-driven mindset?
I think so. I'm sure there's always exceptions to prove the rule, but I think the vast majority of these, and the kind of the way Silicon Valley and the tech culture works is you have to have that vision-driven mindset. Otherwise, these things are just I haven't seen them work without that, really.
All right, let's shift gears here for a second. Before we started the program, we had a discussion about your recent move from Silicon Valley to Austin. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you think about entrepreneurship outside of the Bay Area and what are the opportunities.
I'm getting a lot better with sniper rifles out here on the ranches. We don't do that as much in the Valley. And we got our boots and our cowboy hats. No, it's, Austin's a central city to all of America, and entrepreneurship is becoming a lot more distributed. So there's still parts of the tech world where I think Silicon Valley is far and away number one. I think the revolution in bio and the combination of skills between Stanford, Berkeley, UCSF, and the ecosystem there, I think they are number one in that. We still have a big presence for that. I think the really hard data problems that are like massive scale data infrastructure type open source programs, et cetera, coming out of LinkedIn and Facebook and Google and Oracle and all those places, like I don't think we could just replicate that ecosystem anywhere else. So maybe that's half of what we do, but I think almost everything else can be done at other places, like all the vertical SaaS, there's so many industries based all around the world. And what you're seeing is people are learning how tech cultures work. You're getting tech cultures that are actually legitimate tech cultures in Oklahoma City, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in Tampa Bay, Florida. There's all sorts of these places where you're seeing these great companies come up. We just did something in Iowa the other day that's working quite well the other year. So I mean, there's all these places you never would have thought 10, 15 years ago. And so I think in order to be a great investor, you got to go to where the entrepreneurs are, and we can't just wait in Silicon Valley for them to fly to us anymore.
So let's think about that in the context of outside of the United States. Many of the people listening to us right now are in Brazil. You go to Sao Paulo. The last time I was there before the pandemic, the city was alive and vibrant. And I remember visiting Stone and seeing all of the amazing young people and how hard they were working. How do you think about opportunities in places like Rio or other parts of the world, South America, Europe, and what that might mean for technological innovation?
No, I mean, so you're seeing a lot of centers. Obviously, I think Beijing and Tel Aviv, I think, are the two that I've been most impressed by. I think Sao Paulo, though, is definitely coming up. I think it's definitely in the kind of next list of top 10 or 15 for sure. London, Berlin, obviously a lot in Canada with Vancouver and Toronto, if you don't count Canada as part of America. I'm just kidding. But we're doing a lot in Colombia, in Medellin, and in various places there, in Bogota. There's just all these new centers of real talent, and I think especially Brazil has a very different market. Brazil's a rare place where it's a big enough market that you can actually just build things there. I think my friends did the Open Door of Brazil that I was an angel investor in, right? And that was like, so there's all these things you can kind of take and learn and then change it to fit the local market, because the local market's very different how it operates. And so I think you have a lot of things that are really working in a lot of these countries. They're big enough you can do them locally.
Yeah, my Canadian wife would be the first to remind both of us that Canada is fundamentally different than the United States. But let's shift gears here. What particular areas do you find that are interesting to invest in? I mean, sometimes sectors get hot. You see innovation in an area for a variety of reasons. Is there anything that's kind of coming across your desk right now that's getting you excited?
Yeah, so the big question, if you're thinking like as a venture capitalist, what do we actually do for a living? There's a lot of different possibilities. Some simply just play golf and give money to their friends, but there's a lot more to it than that. There's or at least like we like to tell our LPs there is. There's a couple of things. One is like what's possible now that was not possible 3, 4, 5 years ago, and you get these really interesting waves, right? You get lots of companies that were created all at once because it became newly possible, right? So you have the internet, Web 1.0 waves, kind of the most famous of those waves. And even though a lot of that went bust, you obviously had Google and Amazon and Yahoo and all this other stuff that came out of there that was amazing. And same with Web 2.0, same with the mobile wave. And then you had what we call a smart enterprise wave with the cloud and big data. And my friends and I built tons of companies in that wave. And there's still some smart enterprise wave going on in the more regulated areas and with more new things in AI and infrastructure. I think by far, though, the most interesting new thing happening right now is a revolution in bio. And basically, because of all the tools and everything that have been created, every month we're learning more about biology, more about how life works than we used to learn about it every couple of years. And so because the science and the knowledge is advancing so quickly there, and because there's all these fundamental tools and infrastructure driving the space forward, you're starting to get information data network effects within different areas of biology. And you got some of the same types of bets we used to be able to make 20 years ago in the IT web world, you're starting to be able to make in that world. So you need to know science as well. It's very hard. You have to combine the science with the IT, which is why the Bay Area is so good at it. But I'm just fascinated by all these new possibilities in cell therapy. And we started the company last year. We invested in with friends in biomanufacturing. That's already a very large company doing a lot there with mRNA and gene therapy and cell therapy. So I think the whole world's seeing what's going on there.
See, when you talk about biology and data, right, that creates a whole different set of opportunities and challenges. We look at things like CRISPR. We look at, how that data could be used both to help people and also potentially to hurt people. Are you worried at all about anything that you're seeing that could come up with, the mix of data and biology?
I mean, science is obviously amazing, right? I think just in the last couple of years, we've seen science solve the pandemic. We saw science, as Jon Stewart famously got in trouble for saying yesterday, probably created the pandemic as well, depending on your point of view on these things. And so, I mean, obviously, if you're editing DNA and you're editing how viruses work, we gotta be careful. Like, one of our companies, Synthago, is one of the leading CRISPR companies, and people using that to edit embryos in China. We didn't know that. We sold it to several hundred people, including people in Texas, and then they gave it to someone in China illegally. So I could talk all about CRISPR and editing embryos and the danger of that and the danger of off edits that create cancer. At the same time, this same technology is letting us learn about how the cell works, letting us do cell therapies that have saved already tens of thousands of lives, right, with cancer and others that are accelerating. So you're seeing the V0 cell therapy was able to cure blood cancer because you program the white blood cells to go after the different kind of blood cancers. When they went after tumors turned them off, didn't work. We now figured out how to program these things so tumors can't turn them off as much. So the animals were curing all sorts of forms of tumor-based cancers as well in the last 6 to 12 months. And so there's just all sorts of promising things there. It's definitely a risk. I mean, my wife and I actually started sponsoring Jennifer Doudna's lab. She's one of the co-creators of CRISPR 5 or 6 years ago. And the reason we did is we actually convinced her to start a policy part of her lab where she would go to Congress and educate people on both political sides about the promise of what she was doing along with the dangers. Because one of my biggest fears is something negative happens with these technologies and we shut them all down. And as long as we don't shut these all down, as long as they're used responsibly and they're allowed to continue, I think we're going to save millions of lives. And so I really don't want to shut them all down.
Okay, let's shift gears again. You've been very involved in government activities with your activities in OpenGov and the Cicero Institute. Do you think that this is an area and the potential where we might find that technology and investment areas might be able to improve government efficiency and effectiveness?
I mean, 100%, right? Again, if you go back to the thesis where you're taking the top talent, we're applying it to these giant conceptual gaps in the world, like where are the biggest conceptual gaps in the world? Where are things working? one way where they could be working somewhere else. You don't have to be a genius to see that government has tons of giant gaps. Like it doesn't matter what your politics are, there's lots of ways governments can be doing things better, can be doing things more efficiently, can be fixing the processes they have. So one example I'll just give you is the regulatory state. So the regulatory state in America, there's about 9 million words of regulatory code per state in the US. There's about 1 million commands at the federal level. And most of this runs off of file cabinets and Excel spreadsheets and a bunch of lawyers like sending different documents around, many of which are out of date or they get mistakes on them with track changes. And so you have like this giant spaghetti code of regulatory code that you just have an engineer look at with first principles for the first time. The engineer says, what the heck, guys? This is not how anyone would design this from an information theory perspective. It's obviously wrong. You obviously need some technology here. And it's, in fact, it's so bad that most of them tend to agree. A lot of the regulators like, yeah, we're lawyers, we're not engineers. We've been doing it this way for 50 years. But there's just so many better processes. We've got to create a regulation. If you have one state, how do you compare it to another state? How can you learn what's working from other states? How can you learn what's working from other governments? How do you go back and review things? A lot of times we found in Kentucky, we were doing a big project with them, and we found like 40% of the regulations were like wrong because they hadn't updated when the laws updated. It was just like a giant mess, right? Because there's just never been information technology here. So that's just one area of government. It's a very important area of government. A lot of us believe that economic growth is a lot slower because regulation is done so poorly. I assume this is true in Brazil and other countries, not just America. And just putting technology in there is this force that can make these processes smarter, more transparent, more accountable. There's just all these things to fix. I mean, every area of government I've looked, there's anti-fraud, there's just doing things in smarter ways, there's empowering the knowledge workers in government to do a better job with technology.
Now, one of the things though about working with government is technology is kind of almost necessary but not sufficient, right? You actually have to know how to work the system and know how to work with government entities. And one of the things that we've seen, I think, in the Valley is historically that has not been an area of strength for Silicon Valley and technology companies knowing how to work effectively with government.
It's difficult. Obviously, as you know better than me, as a professor, like Silicon Valley started in a lot of ways working with government, with Hewlett Packard out of Stanford, and with a lot of the early government contracts. And I think the government, the way the military industrial complex worked is they made it more and more and more bureaucratic and complicated to work with them. And that was like a feature for them, not a bug. It's a feature because this meant that the people who were making the most money from these companies could keep out competition. What you've seen, and this is true of a lot of regulated industries, if things get really hard to work with for too long, they start to decay, right? So if you stop competition in an area, if you stop new ideas from winning for too long, it gets more and more and more broken. And so as much as it's annoying to have to work with government, it's hard to have to work with government, and I probably wouldn't have done it in the 80s. If you go fast forward to today, they're still doing a lot of things the same way they did it in the 80s. It's pretty cool because I can walk in and these people don't want to necessarily work with me. They don't know me. They don't know our companies. We're these weird outsiders, but we're like 100 times better than what they're doing right now. It just becomes painfully obvious that they're shamed into having to work with you if you're persistent enough about it, you know?
All right, let's pretend that you're 15 years younger than you are today. Let's pretend that you're starting your career out. Maybe you're like William's age. So what would you be looking at today if you were a 15-year younger entrepreneur, not as accomplished as you are?
You know, one of the things I did at Stanford that was, I think, probably pretty beneficial is I reached out and I tried to learn about a few different areas, and I reached out to the leaders in those fields who I thought were really smart and try to get to know them. And I try to figure out a way to add value to them. And I ended up doing that probably the best with Peter, and I ended up working with him. But just being around people who are building these companies, you'd think you could start from scratch and just figure out how to build something like PayPal. I would have had absolutely no idea if I hadn't been at PayPal, watching them for a couple of years, how the heck some of these things are done and how top technology cultures work and how they work with the business and how they think about strategy and how they think about network effects. This is all stuff that I think maybe you can read more about it nowadays, of course, than you could have back then, but I still think it's just really hard to learn these things if you're not there in person. So I think one of the best things to do is find a way to add value to people who are building early high growth companies or people who are involved in that ecosystem. And if you can build a skill set based on something you've gone deep on and help, and then you get involved and then you learn, right? And so you probably want to choose one or two areas to learn. I think I probably would do a lot more bio now. I wish I'd taken more bio courses if I was going to do it again. I think there's a lot of stuff in fintech that's fascinating. There's a lot of stuff in health services. Health services is an amazing area, the way we measure risk and the way health markets work in our economy and should work, and how to pull things out of hospitals. And so, you could pick an area and really learn it, really become an expert, talk to the best people, find a way to add value to get involved, and then learn from them. That's the framework I would use.
So as a follow-up to that, if we look at all of these, banners behind me and the picture of Memorial Church, there are some people who say that going to college is completely worthless, not necessary, and students should just drop out and start a company right away. Joe, what do you think about that? Are they is William wasting his time, getting his second degree from Stanford? What do you think?
I mean, the first year is probably worthwhile to meet everyone. I don't know about the second year. It's one of those things where Stanford was very valuable to me for the networks it created and for some of the conceptual ways of approaching the world. And frankly, it was fun. I got to go take these like crazy number theory courses and crazy computer science, advanced graphics and courses and make video games. And I didn't always enjoy every course there, but there's a lot of really cool people, cool professors to get to know. So I think it's one of those things where it's really worthwhile for your life to go to these things. Now, if you drop out after a couple years in undergrad or a few years in undergrad or drop after you're in business school because you have something great you want to do and build, you probably do learn in some ways even more from building, but maybe you wouldn't have got to the point where you would have had the right people around you and the right concepts if you hadn't gone to one of these centers. And so I don't think the degree matters at all really, but I think the relationships and how you learn there, and I think it's a lot of fun.
It's good to enjoy going to school. All right, let's transition to the post-pandemic world. All right, let's assume that we can imagine a world where we can start traveling again freely, where you and I can fly down.
We've been post-pandemic for 6 months. I'm just going to say.
Yeah. Rock on. Yeah, we were supposed to be normal today in California, but I think the governor kept his emergency powers. I still can't tell if I have to wear a mask or not in some places. But aside from that, let's imagine a world where like everybody's free. Right, where everybody is free of the pandemic.
Okay, go ahead.
And let's just assume a world where most people have been vaccinated, even if we're getting kind of booster shots. What do you think are going to be the biggest changes? What's going to stick based upon what we learned during the pandemic, or what's going to be new that's going to come out the other side of the pandemic?
My friends don't like these answers. My friends in commercial real estate don't like these answers. I think commercial real estate will be worth a little bit less because you're not going to need as much of it because people don't always want to go into the office every day, and there's ways of sharing it in new ways. So I think that's one. I think similar with travel, a lot of people say, oh, the Zoom world means you have to meet more people and you travel more to see them. And, there's some truth to that. But I think in general, people have learned they don't need to travel quite as much. And then it's actually pretty healthy not to be on the road quite as much as they were. At least for me, I was probably on the road. I have 3 young girls. The eldest is 4. And I was probably on the road about a third of the time. And I'm probably going to cut that down to maybe 20%, which is pretty cool to be able to spend a little more time with them. And it's become more like culturally acceptable to do things on Zoom than to have to fly somewhere for everything, even for cool conferences like this. It's nice to see everyone in person. It's also nice not to have to do that every time, you do a talk. And then, just in general, the world's more distributed, and the whole world works in a more distributed way. There's all these companies that are building things and learn how to build things that way. I think maybe you do more offsites, but then you can just be distributed in general otherwise. There is an interesting shift there, and I think people will be wearing masks also, by the way, for decades. It's kind of like in Hong Kong where everyone wears masks. You're going to see that forever, even regardless of what happens with the science.
Am I going to be teaching in the classroom with a mask, or am I going to be able to teach in the classroom with a mask off, Joe?
I would assume you could teach with a mask off. I don't think Stanford's that crazy, and it's just you think some of your students, especially those with certain political views, are probably going to be more likely to keep wearing masks for a long time. It's almost become like a comfort symbol and a symbol of a certain cultural value. So it's pretty interesting.
Oh, do you think some of those cultural norms that you've described and you've hinted at a few times, do you think they continue to get in the way of innovation and keep people apart? Or do you think they eventually, we find a way to get past all of these challenges that we're seeing in our country and potentially on a global basis?
Yeah, I'm really concerned about the kind of cultural shift from, you've had a certain group go from very strong cultural relativism to something that's no longer truly relativistic, so much as insistence on certain truths, which to me is really, really scary. I think freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought is no longer as something people are promoting as much in certain circles. I think especially in universities. So the studies I've seen is the university administrations have doubled in size at schools like Stanford and others in the last 20 years. And they're pretty much universally on one side of the spectrum in terms of their very, very strong views on this. And it's not on the side of freedom of thought and freedom of speech. And so I'm very nervous about what that means for our institutions that run our country and that determine our culture, because a lot of the culture of Silicon Valley comes out of these same institutions.
Absolutely. Joe, before we open it up to questions from our audience, is there anything else that you want to talk about? Is there anything else that we haven't touched upon that you think our friends in Brazil and throughout the internet might want to hear and you want to share with them?
Well, I'm really bullish on Brazil. Obviously Rodrigo has been a good friend, and we've both friended both of ours, who's done a lot of amazing work in business down there, and just the innovation ecosystem down there has really blown me away. And it's something where I think a lot of us are excited to invest a lot more all around Latin America, but particularly in Brazil. So just excited to see how the entrepreneurial culture there has really been growing the last 5 or 10 years, and I just want to say I'm excited about it. And our firm, we're mostly focused on North America, although we started to write a few checks down there. We'd love to do a lot more. I'd love to meet great people from there.
Yeah, I'm amazed how many of our students actually have returned home and to Brazil, have been so active, doing so many amazing things. We were down, my wife and I were down in the country, I think it was December of 2018, and even going back 9 months later, it was September of 2019, last time I was there, just the difference you could feel in the energy in the startups and in the people in the restaurants was really exciting. I can't wait to get back down there, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Me too. I'd love to go visit and then to see our friend and find some things to invest in.
So William, let me open it back to you. How do we go through the process of now letting questions come in from our audience for Joe?
Thank you, Rob. I'll start reading them, and for the both of you, feel free to chime in. First, we have a question from Martin Lima from Indicator Capital. Do you see more American venture capitalists investing in Brazil in the short term and directly or via local funds?
I don't know the numbers of what's happening with local versus foreign, but I do have quite a few friends who are becoming very bullish on Latin America. I think it's a big deal. We're working on with my team right now, actually, out of Colombia. That's like the biggest thing we're looking at this week, and we're planning on spending a lot more time, doing more in the region. I know a lot of my friends are as well.
Yeah, and just to build on that, a lot of my former students from Colombia, and Joe mentioned Medellin, it's just unbelievable the vibrancy that we were seeing there pre-pandemic. And a lot of people who we know who are starting to head down there, not only American venture funds looking to put down a presence there, but seeing the kind of the influx of capital into the region, setting up local presences. There's a lot of activity.
And Joe, as a follow-up to that, when you think of investing in a different country, a different culture, and obviously like very different regulatory context, there are a lot of challenges. What are the things that you would specifically think of through the lens of an American venture capitalist if you were to invest in Brazil?
Well, I think first you're right. It's a different culture, the different challenges. You gotta be allies and aligned with the people on the ground there. So in Colombia, as far as I've learned, there's 10 families or so, a few of which we know especially well, but who run a lot of the big businesses in the country, and doing things aligned with those families is very powerful. When you walk in to meet the president, the chief of staff to the president is the former CEO of one of the family businesses we know, right? And that's just how the country tends to work with the power structures there. And if you're doing things that aren't aligned with those families, you're gonna have a lot tougher time. And I think it's just you gotta be a realist on these things. You can't invest in the world as you'd like it to be. You have to invest in the world as it is and build as it is. And your job is to hack the world based on what's possible. And this is already hard enough that if you're going against how the country works, you're not going to be successful. So we're definitely trying to make sure we know friends on the ground who've run the right companies, ally with them in the right ways. I think there are some big companies and big families that are very useful to work with down there and learn how it works. And then Brazil is something I'm still learning how to operate in. One of our e-commerce companies has been very successful. Brazil was the place, and I love Brazil, but Brazil is a place that took the longest to get through the port because it was like 45 or 50 days to deliver things that were shipping in because the Americans were not allowed to pay off people at the ports, and so other competitors from China were crushing us because they were going to the ports and they were just making it work right away, and we were like, they were like, you guys, anyway. So there's things like that you got to learn culturally, and we're still learning how to deal with some of those things. But yeah, I'm very bullish on doing things with people who know how these things work.
Perfect. And we have another question from Roberto Baiense. He mentions that Brazil is the largest food producer in the world. Have you been following innovations in the future food, crop control, and generally AgTech in general? And are you bullish on investing in these type of technologies?
So I'm very bullish for the world on what's going on in AgTech right now. So obviously I work a lot in the revolution in bio, and the fact that there's things you could do with microbiome that changes how plants grow, that changes how much milk cows can make, and there's all sorts of things there. There's all sorts of things with greenhouses, and there's tons of companies doing a lot of things there to produce food more cheaply. I think this is a very interesting market if you have a big innovation. I think if you're already in a food company, I think you should be embracing these innovations and making money from them. I personally don't do as much myself in AgTech. I think it's a very tough place to make money because I think the cost of food is low and it's going to continue to go down a lot. And so that's a tough place for me to compete just because there's so many cool ways to make food cheaper. I agree Brazil has a big advantage in that. It has basically infinite water versus everyone else. It has a great food sector. So I think the food sector to thrive, if I owned a big ag company, I would be putting a lot of money into the CRISPR areas and research and the new warehouses and all that stuff. I think as a venture capitalist on the outside, it's hard. I think that one of the big things I learned is distribution matters a huge amount. So in America, I don't know Brazil, for this is where I have to learn Brazil. In America, there's like Monsanto and DuPont and Coke and a couple others, and they own all distribution channels. And we came up with like 10 years ago this great way to make corn and soybeans grow a lot faster with like much better ways of manipulating the bacteria, and very bullish on this. And it turned out it was just very hard unless you gave a lot of the economics to the distributors to make it work. And we ended up selling it for $500 million, and I thought it would have been worth $20 billion. It was like we made these things grow 30% faster. So there's a lot of stuff. It's a tough market, and it's tough to make money on food as an outsider, but yeah, especially if you're already involved in the industry and you partner with the right players, I think it's very interesting.
Okay, now we have an interesting question. Brazil has a lot of issues with corruption, and we're interested in if you have any solutions or any way you can think of using technology to solve that problem.
Yeah, so my company I chair that we started a decade ago called OpenGo. I think he's mentioned it works like over 2,500 cities, municipalities, state agencies here. And the more you could put government processes into the cloud and into technology, the more you can counter corruption, right? So it's not perfect, but a lot of government, if you can put the processes they have to do anyway, so they have to do them through the tech, and so you can go back and audit it and you can see it. Not everything should be transparent to the public, right? It's caused too much of a headache, but it should be transparent to somebody in some groups and other outside groups. They can get to watch it and see what they're doing. One of the rules of Palantir was for whenever the intelligence agency is doing things, we create audit logs. And so if they're doing things they're not supposed to do, the whole point was you could have somebody who can go and watch the watchers. And I think this is just really important with government in general. The more processes, I mean, you'll have cities running their budgets through OpenGov now, right? They're in the whole budget through it. And we automatically flag certain things for everyone involved. And it's like, oh, this thing is twice as much as every other city like us. Oh, interesting. It's the former mayor's cousin who's running it. I wonder if there's something here we should flag, So there's a lot of stuff like that technology can do. And you just got to force the technology to be somewhere where the process is open to somebody and where it's recorded. And anyway, yeah, so there's a lot there. So I'd love OpenGov to do more in places like South America. You can imagine a lot of governments are not excited necessarily to use these things because if they're doing things that don't want to get caught, they're going to be pushing back on technology. That's what you're going to see.
Great, and we have a question from Elio Mosquin from Vale, the largest mining company here in Brazil. How do you see the carbon credit investments and whether they will help or not the climate change innovation?
So, I mean, I think markets are the smart way to solve problems in general. The way we want to get entrepreneurs to work on things and invest in things is if we're using markets. And so I'm very bullish on having some incentives that are logical and tied to those things. I think there's a lot of weird, difficult edge cases that make carbon credits very hard to do. There's a lot of cronyism that you get in that. So I think we've seen so far there's not the political willpower to actually push it forward in a right way. At least it's going to work with the US for a long time. So unfortunately, as much as I do think it's a smart thing to use markets to address scarcity, you're probably going to have to use other techniques. I'm most bullish overall, if you talk about carbon, I'm most bullish on things like using nuclear. I think there's a lot of new advances there that are quite exciting that we're working. I'm bullish on what you could do with solar and nuclear, both scaled up there. I'm also bullish on carbon capture. Right now, carbon capture is $400 a ton. I think with a little bit of incentives, there's different ways I've written about how to do this. I think you can probably get to about $100, $120 a ton. At that point, it's less than 2.5% of the US GDP for us to go carbon negative. So there's a lot of things out there where innovation and economic growth are the right answers, along with the nuclear and solar.
Perfect. Then we have a question from our team. How do you think the pandemic will change the perspective for startups on staying local or going global, and the shift of talent from one country to another?
You know, the distributed thing is interesting because you have a lot more people with distributed international teams. I still think for early on that nothing beats having a small group of people together in person. So as much as I'd like it to be that you just have someone in Austin and someone in Brazil and someone in Eastern Europe all kind of magically working together on a startup, I think there's still cultural barriers. I think it's still very, very difficult very early on to do this. And so I don't know if things change that much with regard to how this works, how you get going. I think you want to have people mostly together in one area or most two areas when you first get going for the core part of it. Now people might say I'm just old fashioned and it's not necessary anymore. I'm open to that. I've founded a lot of companies over the last decade. There's things that have worked out best for me is when we're spending a lot of time together.
Next question from Gabriel Bitarães, and that I think to Rob as well. What are your opinions on ESG and impact investing?
You go first, Rob.
So I think there's two aspects of this. Historically, ESG has not, as an investment thesis, if you think double bottom line, has not yielded venture backable returns and has not been on the frontier of investing for risk versus reward. So the question is, if you assume that's the case, you're either making a decision for non-pecuniary or non-financial returns because you're trying to achieve some other objectives. What I will say, what's different now, I think, going forward is that no matter what you think about climate change or anything else, the younger generation has bought in. And so the younger generation is driving change on this. And so like even if you look at most global energy companies, the only question is when that change is going to happen. And part of it is also being driven by what's going on in China, right? China is trying to, in the mobility industry, is trying to basically legislate their way ahead through electric vehicles. We're all going to be driving electric vehicles, not because of saving the planet, but because China is going to drive volume, which is going to lower costs over time. And so, I think that there's nothing in the past that has shown that it's the best way to get returns. On the other hand, if people are trying to optimize for things other than returns, then if it's somebody's capital, they can choose to invest it wherever they please.
Yeah, no, and I'll say, listen, there's nothing better than innovation for solving the most important problems that are facing our society and our planet. And there's lots of examples of how that works. That said, I think we have to be a lot more skeptical of things that call themselves ESG right now. One of my favorite philosophers is Michael Polanyi, who wrote a lot about the Republic of Science, and he kind of explained in the mid-20th century why government shouldn't dictate where science goes. You need freedom within science to explore, and he ended up creating a lot of theories that kind of defended how free society works and how knowledge works. And really, knowledge is this network that kind of basically you need lots of people competing, and then you need a competition of the ideas, and the knowledge, the correct answers emerge from the consensus. And the problem and they emerge based on systems of incentives and things that can prove things, right? And so ESG right now, there's no logical networks that are actually censoring dumb ideas. When you have a Soviet system top down, that doesn't work. Science doesn't advance that way. Markets don't advance that way. ESG is the equivalent of the Soviet system right now, trying to impose things top down. There's not a good set of incentives. There's not the markets, when the markets have prices for companies, that's like a network where tons of people all kind of agreeing on something, and there's a natural censor for ideas. And so you got to be really careful. I think in general, I think Palantir, we helped with all sorts of things. We eliminate thousands of terrorists. We protected civil liberties. We saved the government tens of billions of dollars. To me, that qualifies as doing lots of good things for the world. Other people hate Palantir because one of the 100 contracts was with Obama's border security. They don't think ICE should have border security. So there's different people will disagree on that. And does that mean Palantir is really great? Does that mean it's evil? Well, I think it's stupid if any one group gets to decide. The market should get to decide, and people should get to decide. And so I'm just very skeptical of a lot of these top-down ESG ratings, and you end up getting a lot of kind of nonsense in there, is my view, the way it's currently practiced.
And by the way, I'll just build on something that Joe said from an investment standpoint. a lot of the attributes of, if we look at, for example, clean energy, like it takes tons of capital to go in, and it might be a 15 to 20 year program. And that might be a system that the incentives of the way venture capital is structured doesn't play well with those types of markets. So it's not clear that that capital type is the right way to try to address these problems. The bad news for that is you don't get the technological innovation, which is what venture likes to chase. But if you don't have an economic structure that can reward that over time, the money won't go there.
Perfect. And we have a next question from Kyle. What will be the next exponentially growing industry no one's paying much attention to right now? To both of you as well.
Well, everyone somewhere is paying attention to all the industries. I'm really bullish on how health services can pull things out of hospitals. So hospitals and health systems, I think, are like one of the biggest kind of criminals in the US right now, and how they operate these local monopolies and how they drive up costs artificially. Whether you're on the left or the right, we want healthcare to be more affordable and more efficient, so more poor people and everyone else can afford it. And there's all these ways in which we can compete with hospitals and health systems. Like, for example, there's technology for how you treat, teenagers and young adolescents with autism. And it turns out you could do it much more cheaply and with much better results with this kind of telemedicine data-driven solution that one of our friends built. And there's like 100 things like that right now, where you're kind of pulling stuff out of the health systems with clinics, with telemedicine, with these like proven techniques. And I'll give you one other one that's really cool. Treating the most expensive people on Medicaid. So a lot of times these are homeless people. These are people who, a lot of them are on drugs. A lot of them are just really bad health, and they're like almost half the cost for some of these Medicaid programs, 40% of Medicaid programs, from like the 5 or 6% of people who are most messed up. And it turns out that you can spend a lot more money sending care workers to go help them, sending people to like get them basic services, to basically like help them like do basic workout stuff, see therapists, whatever it is. There's all these ways you can invest in these really poor people on the streets that actually reduces their healthcare costs, because they don't use the emergency room as much, and they don't use health system in bad ways. And so there's all these things like that where you can use an understanding of data and risk and where our costs are on the health system to take smart action to either compete against the hospitals or proactively invest in those in need and save the system money overall. And so in that case, you're saving 30% of the money we spend on these really poor people overall by being proactive. So I think there's a lot of cool things in healthcare and risk right now that people aren't talking enough about.
The one that I would add, which actually I don't know if it's going to be a good investment area, but I think it's an area that will be transformed, is actually education. And I think that our ability to reach people on a global basis has never been better. In the last week, I have run programs for people in Rio, in Riyadh, in Frankfurt, Germany, in Chicago, all from my home office. And the ability to spread knowledge and spread education is a real opportunity for our species at all levels, K through 12 as well as universities. And it's very inexpensive to do. And so I think that I don't know that that'll lead to venture returns. I don't know that that's kind of like, historically, education's been a horrible place for venture investing. But that said, our ability to improve our lot as a species, I think the pandemic has absolutely accelerated, and I'm more bullish than I've ever been on stuff like that.
That's well said. I think education is really changing for the better right now with this.
Great. And next question we have from Stefano, who's an undergrad at Stanford. Large tech companies in the US and China are already starting to invest in AI and will likely become AI superpowers. How's this is this going to transform or become a barrier when it comes to creating new tech startups, and how does this dominance will affect the Silicon Valley and the world?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm curious also what Rob thinks. I tend to be biased that we're not actually as close to the singularity as people think. I mean, I was at a friend's wedding last week. Elon Musk was there, and I was trying to talk to him about the future of certain industries in 10 years. And he's basically says, AI is going to probably change the world so much that that's the only real variable that matters to the question you're asking. And I empathize with that point of view. If you believe that, maybe I'm not even spending my time well, because this world's gonna be so fundamentally different anyway. In tech, it doesn't matter. I tend to think the world moves in S's and not exponential curves. So I think you go on these big advances and it flattens out for a while, and it advances again and it flattens out for a while. And so I think the consumer space has this massive moats. As I think Google and Tencent and Facebook and Baidu, like, you're not gonna be able to compete against them and the things that touch them directly. But I think the things in the smart enterprise wave and the revolution in bio, in all these new different areas coming up in infrastructure, data infrastructure, and how we do things and how we use AI towards doing new vertical SaaS things. I mean, I think those are all things that are open for everyone to go after. And I don't think that the big giant companies become like superpowers with moats in those areas. I may be wrong, but I'm not as worried about that myself.
So I look at this a little bit differently. I agree with what Joe is saying in that, this notion that the machines are going to take over, I don't buy. The fact that we're all going to be, like the humans in the movie WALL-E, where we're going to be fat and floating through space, I don't buy that. I think what actually is interesting, and the student who asked the question raises an interesting point, is I think that 21st century geopolitical conflict is being shaped by economic ideology and not political ideology. That the 20th century conflict was political ideology and the 21st century is economic ideology. And that's leading to an increase in the relationship between business and government on a global level. That business becomes increasingly about national interests. And that has everything to do with artificial intelligence, manufacturing, jobs, et cetera. And I think the business leaders of the next several decades are gonna have to figure out how to navigate through different cultural and political norms and different government norms, and they're going to have to figure out how to do that in a dynamic fashion. If I were to make an extreme comment, I believe if you look at what's happening in China right now, the Chinese government is in the process of basically taking over the tech sector. They allowed the tech sector to basically develop some pretty impressive technology, get integrated throughout society, and now all of a sudden they're taking it over, right? You see CCP groups inside of companies, and they're really kind of clamping down on legislation, not to protect citizens, but to protect the power of the government. And China in 25 years has become a global economic and military superpower. We've never seen anything like this as a species. And by the way, they took 450 million people out of poverty. From their perspective, not a bad strategy. Now, how that's going to play out and how data is or isn't shared across borders, what we can learn and what people will allow to be doing, what will Europe do, what will North America do, what will Asia do, what will South America do, that's actually, I think, going to be pretty dynamic over the next decade or two. So there's still a lot of unknown in terms of what it's going to mean for entrepreneurs going forward.
The thing I would say is, to me, this is one of the big advantages America has, is it's more free than China. And that we are able to build things separately here. If you look at all of America's attempts the last 50, 60 years to fund technology, it generally, in my view, wastes a lot of money and is very crony. So I'm very scared of the fact that people think we want to be more like China by funding more things, in defense and AI and et cetera. When actually the only things in China that really worked are the ones that were not the state-owned enterprises, that were the separate ones. And then Deng Xiaoping said it's great to be rich, with Lee Kuan Yew mentoring him and deciding to make more of the society open. And China became rich because it was more open, because of free markets, not because of the state top down. So it's going to be a big mistake if people misunderstand China and try to have government doing more of these things. I think that's actually not what's going to happen. But I do agree it's going to be important to work with the government to how we do these things.
We have a follow-up question, I think, to what you mentioned on healthcare, Joe, from Enrique, who's an MBA student at Berkeley. He says, in your perspective, what should be the main responsibilities of governments and private companies in terms of delivering healthcare? And what should be the boundaries that we should set to each of these players? I
mean, listen, there's a lot of people I respect who disagree on this with me, and there's a lot of people I think there's like a moderate view here that I could share, hopefully, where we can kind of ally on. And I think we've basically decided our government's role, at the very least, is we're not going to let people die on the streets, right? So like in 1971, President Nixon said we're going to have dialysis machines, and everyone agreed. And if you have kidney failure, you're going to have the government take care of you at the end. The problem is when government set up that example, is that you get a really bad incentive, because if you're going to take care of end-of-life renal disease and end-of-life kidney care patients, then you actually create an incentive for early stage and mid-stage disease to get pushed to end-of-life as soon as possible without any kind of preventative help, because they know it's going to be free at that point to take care of. So you've broken the market incentive. So in that case, for example, we now spend $50 billion a year on end-of-life kidney disease, and we probably should be spending 10 or 20 if we have the right preventative incentives. And so what government needs to do in all of these areas is it needs to make sure that the ideas can compete, and there's market forces where the best ideas win, and where as much as possible we use choice and we use competition. And so I think it's fine to take care of everyone, but you want to take care of everyone in a way where we still let entrepreneurs have incentives, and we still have incentives in markets to solve these problems, make them more efficient, make the best ideas win. And so hopefully that's like a moderate solution we can have there. And there's all these things I'm talking about where we're ripping things out of hospitals with better solutions. Even if the government's going to be paying for stuff, you want that structured in a way where there's a competition, where if there's a way to do something better for half the cost, that wins, and the good ideas win. And that's how we progress as a society. That's how we become wealthier overall. That's how poor people can afford healthcare too. So that's the framework I'm coming at this from.
Let me see if I can build again on what Joe said, because if I play to extreme comments for the sake, like I would do in the classroom to get the students going. Okay, I think the conflict we're seeing in the 21st century comes at three vectors. Vector number one is what I'm going to call dictatorial capitalism, what roughly we're seeing in China. What might be described here as unfettered capitalism, right? Where we've got actually good innovation, but our cities are a mess. Like no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you walk into our cities and it's embarrassing and shameful. Then you've got what I'm going to call democratic socialism, largely what we're seeing in Europe, where I just want you to name the top 5 great technology companies that have come out of Europe out of the last 3 decades. SAP, Spotify, maybe Adyen, maybe we can come up with a few others, but they have not been able to be innovating on a basis. And we're seeing a lot of these dynamics. And I think what Joe's talking about is there's got to be a way where we can have innovation, but not have people dying in the streets, and find a way to do so cost effectively, right? So I think these are the balances that you and all the business leaders around the world are going to have to deal with. Because by the way, communication and collaboration tools, not slowing down. Yeah. Not slowing down at all, just accelerating over the next decade or two.
I totally agree. And in America, the key thing here is there's lots of monopolies, there's lots of cartels in healthcare. I think the government's job should be to break up those cartels, should be to force them to compete, should be to go anywhere where you see there's not competition, you should go in and you should break it up. I think an active FTC in this area would be something that was wonderful. It should be happening both the for-profit and non-profit health systems, which are both guilty of this stuff.
Wow, I never thought I'd hear you say that, Joe. That's awesome.
We need competition. We need innovation. And this stuff's broken.
Yeah, and we have a question from Eduardo as well. Joe and Rob, analyzing the post-pandemic spectrum, what are your takes on the amount of investment from private equity in these new upcoming industries?
Rob, you want to take that?
Sure. I think in a world of 0% interest rates, capital's chasing returns. So I think what we've got is private equity and venture capital right now are probably oversupplied. And we're seeing companies raise probably more capital than they need on some levels. And we're seeing a lot of companies get funded that shouldn't be. I think as inflation continues to rise, and as long as fiscal policy keeps driving too much spending into the economy, we're going to see more inflation. Eventually interest rates are going to go up, and then maybe we'll see some moderation.
I just closed $1.5 billion actually today for my 2 new funds, and a few companies I built in the last 2 weeks have raised over $1 billion. So I totally disagree with Rob. We need lots more money for everything.
Well, the question we should be asking, and by the way, congratulations on that. The question we should be asking is, are we seeing inflation even in asset prices on companies and everything else because of this?
Of course.
Right.
Of course you are. Of course you are. And this is where the Fed is ridiculous, because all my friends who know the Fed and talk to them, they're like, oh, we're not inflating anything. Asset prices aren't going up. And of course, you're making rich people richer if you're going to print this kind of money.
Right.
It's obvious.
So I think we'll see activity there. And by the way, I'm very optimistic when I look at the younger generation and the things that they're chasing right now. So there's a lot of good stuff that's happening. Hopefully we can have smart policies that will actually continue to enhance innovation.
And following the investment trend, we have another question from Kyle Sartori. Looking at the booms in SPACs, cryptos, it's clear that excess liquidity is affecting the whole financial world. How do you guys see this affecting the VC industry specifically? I think Joe already mentioned it a little bit.
Yeah, there's different parts of VC. I've been building a lot more companies recently. I think I mentioned I built an advanced biomanufacturing company we co-founded with our friend Bob Nelson from Arch, who called Resilience Bio. We raised $750 million for half of it, and shortly after we started it, we bought up a bunch of these really cool manufacturing plants, because we realized early on in the pandemic America was going to need to produce more mRNA, and also we wanted to do more in gene therapy and cell therapy. And then we've just raised another $600 million into that at quite a high valuation. We couldn't have done that 5 or 10 years ago. And that's really cool. It lets you build things you couldn't have built otherwise, because you have capital. You can combine with talent and do things. So it creates new possibilities if you use the capital well. It also makes all of us look like we're really smart in the technology world, because everything we started 10 years ago is now valued really highly. My gross IRR is 45% over the last 10 years. I'm not sure I could do that the next 10 years, but no, it's making me focus more early stage, because there's so much money. These big guys are coming down. I mean, I was on that call with the guy who runs Tiger an hour and a half ago, and looking at a bunch more of our companies, and they're looking at Series Bs, and so like that means me as an venture capitalist, it means I'm doing building, I'm doing seeds, and I'm doing A's for the most part, and I'm doing co-investing with them on some of these others. But it definitely changes how the stack works and where you want to focus as a builder.
And I think, by the way, that's leading to, and we're seeing it in the data, consolidation in venture, where you're getting fewer funds are raising more and more money, and they're vertically integrating. They'll have growth, they'll have venture, they'll have seed. And we saw that in the investment banking industry 15, 20 years ago. Now, there used to be a handful of boutique investment banks that service Silicon Valley that are no longer around. And so you saw that kind of consolidation in that part of the financial services sector. I think we're going to see it in venture because you've got the ability of the larger funds to raise infinite capital if they will, and so they will, and that will basically suck up great entrepreneurs, great opportunities. When someone like Joe's got that much money, if you're a great entrepreneur, you're going to go to Joe for money.
Thank you very much, Rob. And I would like once again to thank our speakers, Rob and Joe, for joining. I think we're approaching time right now. Thank you so much for supporting our conference and for this amazing panel discussion. And I want to also thank all of our audience. We had some of the most preeminent leaders and entrepreneurs in Brazil joining us tonight. And last, I'd like to thank our sponsors once again. Without you, this event would not be possible. And I hope to see you on Brazil Silicon Valley next event. Have a great evening.
Thanks, William. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Good to see you.
See you.